Hello and welcome to this evening's meeting at the Norwegian Holocaust-Center, the Villa Grande, Quisling's villa in Oslo. This meeting is about a Polish resistance man, Witold Pilecki, who went undercover in Auschwitz and was among the first who reported about the crimes done by the Nazi regime. For most Norwegians, this is an unknown story, so we have great expectations to this meeting tonight. It's a joint meeting between the Holocaust Center, the Friends Society of the Holocaust Center, and of course the publishing house Press. And congratulations with your new brand book in Norwegian, then frivillige. And welcome to you, Mr. Jack Fairweather, British journalist and author who dived into the archives, the international archives, to find more knowledge about this extraordinary agent, his work and his civil courage. And also welcome to the Excellencies, Mrs. Ivona Wojtka-Suleslava, she gives thumbs up, and Israel's ambassador, Mr. Alan Roth. Welcome both of you. And a special welcome to Professor Bernt Hagtvet. He's one of the best friends of the Friends Society. He's always ready there for us. He and Jack Fairweather will discuss the importance of Witold Pilecki's work. And welcome to all of you others, and especially those of you Poles who are visiting the HL-Center for the first time. I am Liv Tessem. I'm the leader of the Friends Society of the HL-Center. This meeting will be streamed and it will be conducted by Øivind Kopperud, one of the researchers at the HL-Center. But first, I give the word to Mrs. Ivona Wojtka-Suleslava.
Thank you very much. Good evening, and it's so good that this event can take place. Finally, after all the waves of the pandemic, it's good to be together. And it's very important, and it's very close to a very symbolic date for Poles, because on the 24th of this month, we celebrated those Poles that helped Jews during the Holocaust, trying to escape not only Poland, but actually many different countries. So one of those heroes is definitely Pilecki. It's a really very, very interesting man he was. And his deeds are really a legend and so courageous in all of that. But we discover even now, and that also shows the importance of the digging of history made by historians, but also, as we can see, journalists like Jack Fairweather, into the archives, into the past. We always say to not make the same mistakes. Unfortunately, we can see even now that some mistakes are being remade. And I have to mention, being, a diplomat from Poland, an ambassador of a country that is now a neighbor of a country in war that's being attacked, and which president is a Jew. So for us, it's also a very, very symbolic time we are facing these events. I hope that we will learn a lot about courage, about heroes, but also that we will be able to understand better why it's so important to, take into account those that are telling the truth. And even if this truth is horrible, it's harsh, but to react, because the reaction was the thing that was missing at the time. Nobody believed almost the extent of the extermination, of the Holocaust, of the things being made in the German Nazi extermination camps. So we have to be smarter now. And I'm really looking forward to what Jack Fairweather will be telling us and to the discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, friends, everybody else coming here on this maybe one of the first days of spring in Oslo. It's a slogan that says winter is coming, and even if winter is coming maybe on a political level in Europe, spring is coming to Norway, at least. The American non-fiction writer Anne Lamott once wrote, quote, "For some of us, books are as important as almost everything else on earth. What a miracle it is that out of these small, flat, rigid squares of paper unfolds world after world after world. Worlds that sing to you, comfort you, quiet or excites you. Books help us understand who we are and how we are to behave. They show us what community and friendship mean. They show us how to live and how to die." End of quote. Jack Fairweather's book about the Polish underground operative Witold Pilecki does exactly that. It takes us through a journey of belief and disbelief. A journey through tragedy, but also hope, life and death. From a historian's perspective, it also tells a story about what kind of new knowledge we can get from the archives and how archives can also be used as political tools to prevent stories from being told. The book, Den frivillige in norsk, The Volunteer in English, is both an empirical study of the past, the Holocaust and the Second World War, but it's also a warning about the use and abuse of historical facts, and about withholding knowledge. In present-day Europe, academics are still concerned about gaining access to archives. There is a possibility that governments will deny access to archives to prevent academics from telling stories that they don't want to be told. When I read this book, and I read this book, it was still the courage on a personal level that struck me the hardest, as it often does when I read about the Second World War and especially the Holocaust. In our own exhibition here at the center, it's also the stories about individual courage that strike me the most. Many historians and academics have a tendency to explain historical events with structures. The individual choice is somehow shadowed by these structures. This may quite often be the correct way to address different questions, but sometimes historical events come down to personal involvement and personal courage. The story about Witold Pilecki is about everything else, a story about personal courage. It's a story about how an individual put his own life at risk for fellow human beings and for the cause of the greater good. This is probably why the book opens with a quote from the German Augustine monk Thomas A. Kempis, who wrote, quote, "Whoever loves much, does much. Whoever does a thing well, does much. And he does well who serves the community, common community before his own interests." End of quote. Jack Fairweather has, in addition to be the best-selling author of The Volunteer, served as a Daily Telegraph's Baghdad bureau chief and as a video journalist for the Washington Post in Afghanistan. His war coverage has won a British Press Award and an Overseas Press Club Award. He's also the author of A War of Choice and The Good War. Thank you, Jack Fairweather, on behalf of all academics and everyone else, for searching through archives and uncovering stories that need to be told. The floor is yours.
That's a dramatic introduction. Got you on your toes. Thank you, Øivind, so much, and for everyone at the Holocaust Center for hosting me. Is this loud? Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, all right, good. When I began my book in 2015, the events of World War II seemed impossibly far away. I thought my challenge was going to be to find a way to bring readers into the world of this World War II character Witold Pilecki. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has brought home for all of us the horror of war. And it's made Pilecki's story of resistance to the Nazis more present, the lessons more urgent than ever before. I'd like you all to begin by picturing a scene with me. It's 6 a.m., September the 19th, 1940, and a Polish underground operative named Witold Pilecki sits in the Żoliborz district of Warsaw. This is a wartime image of that apartment. Pilecki was on the third floor, which belonged to his sister-in-law. And here is Pilecki on the left, as you look at it, in his favorite plaid jacket. At the start of the war, Pilecki was 38 years old, a reserve officer in the Polish cavalry, a farmer, a devout Catholic, and a father of two. Here is Pilecki sitting on the steps of his farmhouse in eastern Poland. Here is a picture of his wife, who's a school teacher in the local village. And this is one of my favorite pictures of the two of them together. It's them on their wedding day. And you can just see Maria, his wife, bursting with pride, and Pilecki too. And here are their two children, Andrea and Zofia, who were born in 1933 and 1935. And there they are, in fancy dress. Pilecki liked to get them dressed up after school and put on little plays for Maria. Before the war, Poland was one of the most pluralistic societies in Europe. A tenth of the population is Jewish, the largest such community in Europe. Then the Germans invaded in September 1939. Here we see German troops parading through Warsaw under the eye of Adolf Hitler in October. Hitler had yet to formulate his plans to annihilate Europe's Jews at this stage. Instead, he was intent on the destruction of Poland by eliminating its professional classes. Poland is subject to a brutal reign of terror, and thousands of Poles, doctors, teachers, writers, lawyers, Jews and Catholics alike, are being dragged from the street to be shot or interned. 50,000 Polish nationals are murdered in the first 4 months of the occupation. The following year, in 1940, the Germans opened a new concentration camp to hold some of those prisoners. Its name was Auschwitz. Here we see a pre-war picture of a map of Poland. Pilecki's village is Krupa with the top right arrow. The southern arrow points towards the Polish town of Oswiecim that the Germans called Auschwitz. Little is known about what's happening inside, but Pilecki's learned from informants that a roundup is scheduled for Żoliborz district that morning, and that those arrested will be sent to Auschwitz. That's why he's sitting in the apartment, because his mission is to infiltrate the camp, forge a resistance cell, and gather evidence of Nazi crimes. So let's go back to the apartment again. And imagine with me the sound of trucks rumbling to a stop outside, shouts and gunshots that follow. The building caretaker bangs on the door, and his sister-in-law, whose place it is, answers. "It's a German roundup," says the caretaker. "Get out while you still can." They hear the sound of Germans entering the building. What does Pilecki do? He calmly puts on his jacket and then notices that his 3-year-old nephew is sitting up wide-eyed in bed and that his teddy bear has fallen onto the floor. The little boy is terrified. As the door bursts open, Pilecki picks up the toy and hands it to his nephew. "See you soon," he whispers to the child. Then, against every instinct he must have had, he steps into captivity. 3 days later, he arrives in Auschwitz. And this will be an image familiar to many of you. It's from 1945, shortly after the camp's liberation. Those infamous words, "Arbeit macht frei," work sets you free above the gate. And here is Pilecki now as a prisoner. Over the next 2.5 years, Pilecki forged an underground cell in Auschwitz that sabotaged facilities, assassinated SS officers, and plotted an armed uprising. He arrived in Auschwitz at its very beginning, when it was a concentration camp for Polish nationals. Thus, he witnessed the steps by which the Nazis conceived of and built their death factory for Europe's Jews. He was the first to alert the world to the camp's horrors through his smuggled reports, and he was the first to try and stop them. 3 years before Allied commanders publicly acknowledged the camp's existence, Pilecki was urging them to bomb it. And yet, for all of his exploits in Auschwitz, his story is almost unknown outside Poland. Indeed, I only came across it by chance. In 2011, I met up with a reporter friend of mine, Matt. We covered the wars together in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're trying to make sense of our experiences. I got caught in a suicide car bombing, and this is actually a picture a few moments after the attack. I was in that tank there. Fortunately, the blast doors of the vehicle had closed just enough, so the force of the explosion traveled away from me and the men inside. But there then followed an hour-long firefight. That's me in my press jacket. Matt had traveled to Auschwitz and learnt about a resistance cell in the camp. The idea that anyone could resist the Nazis in a place like that was a shock to me, because I think, like a lot of you, I thought of the camp as the ultimate symbol of suffering and victimhood. And yet Pilecki seemed to offer a startling new way to see the camp, not through the eyes of a victim, but through the eyes of a protagonist. I also felt personally challenged by the story, because when I began my research, I was the same age that Pilecki had been at the start of World War II. I also had a wife and 2 little kids and a home. What would make Pilecki risk everything on such a mission? And what was it about the act of volunteering that spoke so powerfully to me? I knew I had to find out more, but then I discovered the other startling fact about Pilecki's story. So little was written about him outside of Poland at this point. I could only find a little bit online, that Pilecki had gone on to fight against the communist takeover of Poland at the end of World War II. He'd been captured and executed by the communist regime, and all trace of his wartime record was either destroyed or locked away in the military archives. Even mentioning his name in Poland could lead to arrest. It wasn't until 2012 that one of Pilecki's reports, written at the end of the war, was finally translated into English. And that report, for many, many years, had sat in this fairly nondescript suburban house in Ealing, West London, which was home to many of the documents that the Polish underground managed to save from the communists and Soviet forces that took over Poland in 1945. And this is Pilecki's report, written at the very end of the war. And I particularly like it because you can see his looping blue handwriting around the edge of the page. These are his edits written in haste between the end of the war and his decision to go back and fight against the communists. And this is where that report, this incredibly historical document, sits to this day in that beige folder on the second shelf, not in the National Library in Warsaw, where perhaps it should be, but kept very safe, it must be said, at the Polish Underground Study Trust. What Pilecki wrote in that report only deepened the mystery for me, because the report was filled with gaps. Names were hidden to protect colleagues, events were obscured or omitted, and the report also left unanswered crucial questions that Pilecki himself never found out the answer to. What happened to the intelligence he risked his life in Auschwitz to gather? Why were his calls for action unheeded by the Allies? How many lives might have been saved had the world paid attention? 5 years ago, I set out to try and answer these questions and the deeper mystery of his motivation. I flew to Warsaw in January 2016 on a reporting trip. The first person I wanted to see was Pilecki's son, Andrzej. I was a little bit nervous ahead of meeting him for the first time. After all, who was I to suddenly alight on his dad's story? Andrei had been little more than a child when Pilecki was executed. Here he is again in fancy dress with his sister. For 50 years, he'd been told that his father was an enemy of the state. He only started to learn details of his father's mission in the 1990s when the communist archives were opened. Of course, I shouldn't have worried about meeting Andrei because he was the most delightful, compassionate, engaging man. Although he did warn me, this is his apartment, by the way, very typical research scene, tea and cake and lots of good conversations. He did warn me on that first meeting, I'm not sure what you'll find out about my father or where you should start looking. And I said, Andrei, I'm starting with you because when so little is known about your dad, anything that you could tell me is going to help me recreate his thinking, because I felt that I couldn't make up anything about Pilecki's thoughts. I needed people like Andrei or written documents to tell me what motivated this great man. What I found amazing about the beginning of my research in Warsaw was just how many people were still alive who had known Witold. Some had never shared their memories before, either because they dared not to or simply because no one had asked them. Men like Bohdan Velasek, 90 years old when I met him, a Warsaw upriser, along with Jerzy Szakczewski, 94 years old. Both of these men had fought alongside Pilecki during the 1944 Warsaw uprising, and neither had actually spoken about their intimate experience of fighting alongside Pilecki. In addition to gathering the living testimony, I also wanted to follow in Pilecki's footsteps as much as possible. Warsaw was devastated in the fighting of 1944, but incredibly, some of the key sites still exist, and none was more important to me than that apartment where Pilecki's mission began. It was, in fact, the very next place I went to after meeting Andrei. Here is that apartment in 2016. And of course, I wanted to get inside and try and visit those rooms. Oh. So, rang various doorbells. And Pilecki's apartment's on the 3rd floor, number 7, and we knocked on the door and no one answered. And so we were a little bit disappointed having come all that way. But my researcher, Marta, said, well, as we're here, why don't we just record what it must have sounded like when the Germans came barging through the door and stamped up the steps. So she did just that with my tape recorder out, and then she banged on the door, Gestapo style. And actually, that's what it took to wake up the rather sleepy students inside who had, of course, no idea who Witold Pilecki was, and indeed this very nice lad who let us in also didn't know that his bedroom was the historic place where Pilecki began his mission to Auschwitz. Clearly, he also didn't know how to tidy it up. To describe such scenes, I felt like I needed to see them with my own eyes, but even better was when I could combine locations with witnesses of him in action. So you will remember the 3-year-old nephew to whom Pilecki handed his teddy bear. Here is a picture of the boy in 1939 sitting on Pilecki's lap. And here he is 80 years later when I got to meet him on the banks of the Wisła. And I took Marek, is his name, back to the apartment, and it was the first time he'd been back in over 70 years because his family had been kicked out of the flat by the communists after the war. So here is Marek confirming that that door we banged on was, in fact, the original door. And here he is with Marta explaining the layout of the apartment. Bringing Marek back to the apartment made him remember the moment with the teddy bear that, for me, spoke so eloquently of Pilecki's ability when under extraordinary stress to look beyond himself. Then Marek recalled the moment that Pilecki was arrested.
The door was One was in an army suit, German, and another civil.
Yes.
And they ask mother if there are any men. There is any man here. In this same moment, uncle moved from this room. Ask what's going on? What's going on? And
He was ready to go. He had his jacket on, or
I think he was prepared because he has time to
yes.
no.
Yeah. But what did he say to you when he was leaving? Did he say anything? Do you remember? Did he,
See you
hug
soon.
See you soon.
You can see him tearing up a little bit there, and those tears came on more as we spoke about the meaning of Pilecki to him and his family. To write the book in the vivid and compelling way I wanted to, I knew I needed hundreds, if not thousands, of details like that teddy bear. And it was only upon visiting the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum that I realized where I would find them. This is my first trip of many to Auschwitz. The camp now holds a museum that was created in 1946. It has an archive of over 3,500 prisoner testimonies by camp survivors, hundreds of which either touched on Pilecki's work or described events that he witnessed. Many had never been translated before. This is one of my favorite rooms. This was actually a barrack room used by the prisoners, now converted into the research department, and here are many of the testimonies which we would pore over looking for evidence of Pilecki, and sometimes also going to the collections department to find original artifacts. This, amazingly, is a diary written by one of Pilecki's men secretly inside the camp in 1942 that describes the start of the Holocaust in Auschwitz that was secretly smuggled out. Let's go back to the moment that Pilecki arrives in the camp. It's evening, September the 21st, 1940. A light drizzle is falling. The train screeches to a halt, and the men in the cattle truck with Pilecki get to their feet. They hear shouts, dogs barking, doors slamming open. Then it's their turn. They're blinded by spotlights, dragged from the train, beaten, punched, kicked, and forced through the gates. Pilecki is then stripped and shaved and issued striped prison clothes, given a number in place of his name. There are no photographs that capture the brutality of arriving in Auschwitz, but incredibly, some of the prisoners who arrived around the same time as Pilecki, who survived, painted pictures of what it was like to arrive in Auschwitz after the war. And here is one of those pictures. You see the prisoners getting showered down with either boiling cold or boiling hot water or cold water. When the prisoners were stripped, this was often a moment when Polish Jewish prisoners would be revealed by their circumcisions. This was before the final solution, before Auschwitz was a center for the extermination of Europe's Jews. But this was still a moment, a terrible moment, when Jews were being singled out for special punishment and beatings. Probably that prisoner on the floor there was one such. After being registered in the camp, they would then attend the roll call square. This is a really rare photograph, in fact, the only one from the early camp in early 1941. The roll call square was just to the left, where, with the help of some prisoner artwork, we can imagine what it was like as Pilecki, now as a prisoner, stood for the first time with those who had arrived. There they all are. There was a roll call at dawn, midday, and evening. A very brutal ritual, especially in the evening time when those prisoners that had starved to death or been beaten to death and died were gathered to be counted for the final time before they were led to the camp's crematorium. A few weeks before Pilecki's arrival in Auschwitz, the SS had built the very first ovens in Auschwitz to help them cremate the dead, and already they were saying in internal documents that they needed more ovens to cope with all those who were dying. This is Auschwitz's very first oven from September 1940. Pilecki's report from 1945 describes his first few days in the camp vividly, but I wanted more details because the more details I could find to recreate scenes, the closer I could come to understanding Pilecki's responses, and that's what I wanted after all. A way to delve into his thinking and start answering that question: how was resistance possible in a place like Auschwitz? Pilecki doesn't describe the moment when he started recruiting in the camp, but I found a testimony by one of his first recruits, Konstanty Piekarski, or Kon for short, a young 20-year-old Polish man, and he, after the war, wrote down this incredible moment of being recruited by Pilecki. It was an evening about a week or so into their time in the camp, when prisoners were allowed to gather outside the barracks to socialize before the camp curfew. They would often gather here, an area called Boken Alley, for the birch trees you can see. By this stage, a week into their time in the camp, all the prisoners are starving. They're on less than 1,000 calories a day, forced to do brutal, hard labor around the camp. They're covered in welts and beatings. Here's a bit more prisoner artwork to show you some of the fear and tension that the prisoners felt. You can see them looking nervously over their shoulders, trading food. Pilecki takes Kon to one side and reveals to him the secret of the underground, which at that stage is pretty much just Pilecki. And Kon's response always makes me smile a little bit because he's very honest to Pilecki. He says, "Pilecki, are you nuts? Look at us. We are in no fit state to fight back against the Nazis." But then Kon realized something, that Pilecki, by revealing his mission to him, had actually entrusted him with his life. Because Kon, if he wanted to, could turn around and tell the nearest guard, "Oi, this guy's with the underground," and trade in for some bread or a job indoors. But he didn't, because he realized that what Pilecki was offering him was something more important than food. He was offering trust and the hope that something greater than themselves could endure in the camp. Of course, Pilecki realized that hope wasn't enough in itself. He needed to start fighting back. He had wanted to perhaps stage a breakout from the camp, but realized that that would be impossible given the condition of the prisoners without help from the outside. So he needed to start gathering intelligence to persuade the Allies to intervene. The challenge he faced was, how on earth do you get a message to the Allies from there? He thought about escape, but he knew it would be dangerous, and that, in fact, attempts always led to very harsh reprisals against the rest of the camp. But then, about a month into his time in Auschwitz, Pilecki learned that a prisoner was going to be released because the man's family had paid the right bribes in Warsaw. And so through an intermediary, Pilecki approached the man and persuaded him to carry a report to Warsaw. He couldn't write anything down, of course. That would be impossible in case they would ever be discovered. So instead he had the man memorize those words of his that he wanted to pass on and swear to give them faithfully to the leadership in Warsaw. What were those words that whispered by Pilecki one evening in the roll call square under the noses of the Nazi guards? No one had succeeded in tracking them down, because all that Pilecki gives us in his own writing is the name of the courier, Alexander Wielopolski. Armed with that single name from Pilecki, my brilliant researcher in Warsaw, Louisa, managed to track down Alexander's son, an elegant gentleman in his 80s named Piotr. And I think, like so many families of resistance fighters in Poland, Piotr had no idea about his father's role. It's worth just pausing on that fact for a moment, that here am I, a Brit journalist coming to the story and telling this man about his father's incredible role, being the very first witness to the horrors of Auschwitz on behalf of Pilecki. That presented us with a slight problem, of course, because it meant that Piotr had no knowledge about what his father did with that report. But he did have the name of his father's best friend, a man called Dębinski, who he thought he might have stayed with in Warsaw. And so armed with that name, my researcher in London sifted through the archives at the Polish Underground Study Trust, which you saw before, and one evening she gave me a call, and I could hear the emotion in her voice. She said, "Jack, I found it. I found Pilecki's report," because that name, Dębinski, had allowed her to sift through the hundreds and thousands of missives stored in the archive to find the one folder of documents that charted the progress of Pilecki's report across occupied Europe to the Polish government in exile in London. I write about that amazing journey in the book, but I wanted to share with you those words whispered by Pilecki to Alexander in Auschwitz. This is what Pilecki had to say, and it gave me goosebumps when I first heard it, and I think it may for you too. "We beg the Polish government, for the love of God, to bomb the camp and end our torment. Should we die in the attack, it would be a relief given the conditions. This is the urgent and well-considered request sent on behalf of comrades by the witness of their torment." Already in 1940, Pilecki recognized that what was happening in Auschwitz was so terrible it was worth his life and everyone else's in the camp if they could destroy the place. I dug around some more and discovered that Pilecki's report was handed on to the head of the RAF, Charles Portal. I found the extensive correspondence between Portal and his commanders about whether or not to bomb Auschwitz. And I'd like to pause there for a moment too and just think about that extraordinary achievement. Pilecki's words, composed in the most dire conditions imaginable, now being discussed at the highest levels of the British government. Pilecki didn't just do this once. By my count, he sent at least 10 reports via secret messengers from the camp that charted its evolution into a death factory. He described the start of the program to euthanize sick prisoners, early gas experiments against Soviet POWs. All of his reports made it to London. Each of them called on the Allies to take action. That's why his work in Auschwitz is so historically important. He was revealing to the world just how the Nazis could conceive of and murder on an industrial scale. Then in the summer of 1942, the first transports bearing Jewish families from all over Europe began arriving in a vast new camp called Birkenau that the Nazis were constructing nearby to the main camp in Auschwitz. This was the start of the Holocaust. Many of these images will be familiar to you. It's an arrival of a Hungarian transport into the camp in the summer of 1944. Men and women were separated. Those who could work were registered in the camp. Those who were not were sent to be gassed. These images of children were taken by Russian soldiers when the camp was liberated. All of those kids survived, but of course when I see those images, I think of all those children that did not. And here is aerial footage of that new camp, Birkenau, built beside the main camp of Auschwitz. This was an agonizing moment for Pilecki because by 1942 he built up an underground of almost 1,000 men. He had an uprising plan ready to go. He'd identified a reserve arms depot to raid. He knew which bridges to blow up to cripple the camp. He was waiting for a signal from the Allies. In fact, he'd even, at this point, stolen a radio transmitter to broadcast, literally, calls for help. No word came. Pilecki struggled to understand why. He wondered whether he had failed to capture adequately what was happening in the camp. That autumn and winter, the scale of the murder rapidly escalated. By the end of 1942, 200,000 Jews had died in Auschwitz. And Pilecki was actually racked, as he describes it himself, by a sense of guilt. And I'd like to share with you now another incredible image. This was a portrait of Pilecki made around this time inside the camp by a fellow prisoner that remarkably, incredibly survived. And I think it captures a little bit about how Pilecki felt at this time. Desperate to take action, horrified that he was living when so many were dying, unsure what to do. He wasn't going to give up. Instead, he used his sense of shame to push him into his final act of heroism in the camp. He concluded that he needed to escape the camp himself to try and rally a force to attack it. The question was, how? Pilecki hit upon an idea, his first idea, about using the camp's sewers. And he spent much of the early part of 1943 prizing open every night a manhole cover in the camp and slithering on his belly through the tunnels of the sewers, through the excrement of 10,000 prisoners. Of course, I also wanted to take a look, and this was the manhole cover that Pilecki himself went down, and these are the tunnels that he explored under the camp. Fortunately for me, of course, they're much cleaner than in Pilecki's time. But what I discovered was the same thing that Pilecki did, that through twists and turns, it all ended in metal grills, and the one tunnel that he needed that was closest to the river by which he could escape was also right next to Commandant Hearst's garden and his dog kennel. It wasn't the way for him to escape, but he knew he had to keep on looking. That spring of 1943, prisoners had started work on building new gas chambers in Birkenau that would increase its killing capacity to 4,500 people a day and turn the camp into a true death factory. These are some of those new crematoria being built in Birkenau, and here is a crematorium plan designed from the desk of the SS architects in Auschwitz. We have this plan today, incredibly, because Pilecki's men stole it from under the noses of the SS architects and found a way to smuggle it out of Auschwitz to Warsaw in the hope that it would tell the world what was happening in Auschwitz. Finally, Pilecki hit on a desperate plan. He identified a bakery outside the camp where inmates worked, and he arranged for the escape with 2 other prisoners. And it was a bit of a mad one because it involved dashing from the bakery during the night shift and then embarking on a 60-mile journey across Nazi-occupied Poland to a safe house in the hills outside Krakow. Once again, I found the best way to discover how he managed such a feat was by following in his footsteps. The bakery no longer exists, but my researcher Marta and I were able to find the spot where it stood. And so we decided on the same day, at the same moment, albeit 73 years later, we would stage our own escape from the camp. And this is where that bakery stood, now just opposite a McDonald's. On the outskirts of Oswiecim. And this is the route that Pilecki took. He ran about 10 kilometers, tired and hungry, until he got to the banks of the Wisła, which he then took a boat and waded across until he reached those fields on the far side, just as dawn was coming and the sirens of the camp were sounding for his escape. He rested in some woods and then had to take this long journey, dangerous journey, with the camp SS beginning to look for him as he hid with villagers for the 60-mile journey all the way to Nowy Wisnich, where he found a safe house to rest up. And here is a wartime image of that house where he found shelter for several weeks. And I also got to see that house. Here is Pilecki just after his escape. This is the host, Thomas Serenfinski, and his daughter. And here's the house when I got to visit it. You see, it looks remarkably the same. And that little girl you just saw, here she is, many years later, making me a cup of tea, and so sweetly made a big spread for us. And that table where we were sitting was where Pilecki wrote his first report about Auschwitz as a free man. You can just saw a little clip of that text. I think as a biographer, you're always in pursuit of the person you're writing about, trying to catch a glimpse of him, trying to understand who he is and what he's doing. And sitting at that table, I felt like, at least briefly, I had caught up with Pilecki. But for all of his feats in the camp, his escape, his desperate struggle against the Germans in the Warsaw Uprising, his stand against Poland's communists after the war, I find myself coming back to that Warsaw apartment and Pilecki's first act of courage. And here's why. Because in that act of volunteering, Pilecki set himself on a trajectory that was different to every other person sent to the camp. Pilecki was there by choice. He chose to go to Auschwitz. He chose to form an underground cell. He chose to smuggle reports out of the camp. Why is that act of choosing important? Because he reminds us that empathizing with the suffering of others beyond our immediate family and friends is also a choice. As the fate of his reports show, it's not the instinctive response of many people to seek to come to the rescue of others, especially if they themselves are in danger or facing hardship. But just because it's not our instinctive reaction, that doesn't absolve us from taking action. The Nazis were counting on the world turning away from their crimes. Simon Wiesenthal recounts being told by an SS guard upon his arrival in one camp, "However this war may end, we have won the war against you. None of you will be left to bear witness. But even if someone were to survive, the world would not believe him." Pilecki asks us, no matter how gruesome the subject, no matter how difficult our own circumstances, that we never stop trying to understand the plight of others. This is the last picture of Pilecki as a free man in 1946, taken a few months before he was captured and arrested by communist secret police in Warsaw. He was executed 2 years later following a show trial. He died believing that he had failed to deliver his message. My hope is that this book will show that it wasn't Pilecki that failed to raise our awareness about Auschwitz. He succeeded in alerting the world. The failure to take action lies elsewhere. So the past 5 years, I felt compelled to follow in Pilecki's footsteps. As a reporter, I've always felt drawn to extremes, and I have found none greater than Pilecki's story of survival in Auschwitz. It describes the worst that we can do to each other, but also, incredibly, some of the best. The book came out in 2019 in the US and the UK. Since then, it's been translated into 25 languages and forms the basis of a major exhibition that's opened in Berlin. I've also found the name of a Jewish family that Pilecki saved following his escape from the camp in Warsaw. I'm in the process of trying to apply with Yad Vashem for him to be recognized as one of the righteous among the nations, the special honor for those who are recognized for rescuing Jewish families during the war. I've come to believe that Pilecki is one of the greatest heroes of the Second World War. His story reminds us that we must listen for the voices of brave men and women everywhere trying to raise to us stories of suffering. And of course, when I say that, I think of Ukraine and wonder, are we listening to the new Pileckis who are out there? Are we taking action as Pilecki so desperately wished? Please help me in sharing Pilecki's remarkable story and join me in following his footsteps. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jack, for a very interesting lecture and not at least very well presented. It was, hope many academics here actually watch this, how a journalist can actually present extremely difficult and interesting stuff. so everybody of us can understand. Now we're going to have a conversation up here. So Bernt Hagtvet and Jack, please take your seat.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for your patience.
Jack, nei, Bernt. Hvis du sitter der, så kan jeg sitte der. After a lecture like this, it's good to have a conversation about different aspects. But we'll also, after 20-25 minutes, open the floor for questions, so you all can participate. When I sat down, I was going to prepare for this. I had a lot of questions. Some of them were quite silly. Some of them were questions that you can ask any author at all. But then I sent over the questions to Bernt, and we had a conversation about the questions. And actually, Bernt is going to ask, I'm going to ask the question, but it's actually Bernt's question. It's a very complex question, and it's very difficult to answer, and you will probably get a Nobel Prize if you can answer that.
I'm ready.
But this is a conversation, so we're going to start with a very complex questions, and it will probably be more easier later on. The first question I will ask is, and it's Bernt's question, why do some people have more moral resources, more courage, more integrity than others, which enable them to resist evil?
I think that's a really good question. I think we can all agree. So here goes for the Peace Prize. I think it's important to say about Pilecki that he was a devout Catholic. His faith was important to him. He was a patriot in the sense that he believed in his country and was ready to fight for it. Those were elements of his moral compass that helped steer him in the camp when, in a place where the Nazis tried to strip away the identity of every prisoner, he was able to hold to those values of his. But I think what struck me about his story and getting to know him and getting to know those who knew him was a quality of his that I think for those of us who are not Polish, not Catholic, don't have the same set of moral compasses as Pilecki, we can also touch. And that is Pilecki's extraordinary ability to trust others. And that scene for me with Kon Piekarski in the camp when he's beginning his underground, that simple act of trust was a superpower in a place like Auschwitz, was an incredible act of resistance. It wasn't sort of big Hollywood stuff, it was just that simple act of saying, I'm going to share with you knowledge that, and make you my brother in arms, or sister in arms. And I think that quality is one we can all relate to on some level, and doesn't quite answer the question about why in certain circumstances some find the ability to trust, but I think we all know in ourselves moments when we've trusted others and the effect that can have on ourselves and those around us. And I just ask everyone to reflect on those moments. We don't all have to be in Auschwitz to discover that ability in ourselves.
Well, there is a tension here. What do you think Pilecki would have said about the moral courage of the Pope in these dire times?
In as much as he was seeking for the world to take notice to what was happening in Auschwitz, and in as much as, to our knowledge, as best we know, given that the Vatican's archives are still, in many cases, locked away, the Pope was not taking the action that was required. In fact, as the first reports of the Holocaust started reaching the West, the Americans went to the Pope to ask him, is it true what's happening? And in fact, the Vatican had incredible network across Europe.
In Lviv, for example.
In Lviv, in Warsaw, across Catholic southern Germany, and it seems extremely likely that he knew what was going on. He chose not to make a stand, and that meant the Americans at that point chose not to make a stand. Months were then lost when the world could be taking action. And when those images of the trains arriving, and just thinking that in 1944, 4 years after Pilecki was telling the world about the horrors of Auschwitz, people were getting on trains bound for the camp, not knowing what awaited them is terrible.
Yeah, Eichmann murdered about 460,000 Hungarian Jews in a matter of months in 1944 with a little squad of soldiers. But there's an interesting religious parallel here. In the French village of Chambord-sur-Lignon, where, by the way, Albert Camus wrote his La Peste, there were 2 Huguenot ministers. This may be important. 2 Huguenot ministers who simply went to the people in Chambord and said, we have been asked to save Jews. Shall we save the Jews? Not one said no. And one old man said, what would Jesus have done? And the whole village of Chambord saved about 4,000 Jews right under the nose of the Vichy police, carrying them over to the Swiss border. So religion can be a motivating force, yes. Humanism can be a motivating force. Politics, communism, can be a motivating force. We know, for example, the Swiss guard Grünberger, he realized that all the borders in Europe were closed. And a growing number of Jews came to the Swiss border. What he did was to send out people into the terrain and instruct the Jews what they were supposed to say to get into Switzerland. He saved many Jews on the Swiss border. He was, of course, arrested. Switzerland has never been known for its moral courage. So he was arrested, and it took about 20 years for his daughter to have the Swiss government acknowledge his moral courage. So there are different sort of motivations. About 700 Jews remained alive in Berlin in 1945. In this country, we have Grenselose, the people who took Jews across to Sweden. You ask them. Very few had religious convictions. You simply ask them, of course, isn't this the way we should do it? As a matter of fact. And Grünberger said the same thing. Now, isn't this the way the Swiss are? Just a basic humanist attitude. But we should also remind ourselves, which Walter Lacour has shown, that within the Royal Air Force there were strands of anti-Semitism. Very few Jews in Britain, about 300,000, but there was no wish to bomb Auschwitz because it was outside the strategy of the RAF strategy. So Auschwitz was never bombed. So it was very moving that Pilecki said, we may die, but that's better than we die, than this continues. That was a very moving quote.
Yes, well, I think that ability to look beyond your immediate family and friends, it is, I think, what we celebrate in Pilecki's story, and indeed of all those who showed that moral courage. Yeah. I think it's also worth reflecting on why that his reports didn't land in London and Washington, and I think you're right, anti-Semitism played a role, but there's actually an amazing quote by a Dutch theologian who worked in rescue efforts during the Second World War, who said that yes, there was anti-Semitism among British and American officials that prevented rescue, but actually even greater than that was the failure of imagination, the lack of courage to lean into the horror of what people were hearing.
Yes.
And I think that is again something we can all relate to when we indeed look at what's happening in Ukraine today. I know struggle myself to sort of read about what's happening there. But I think that's what Pilecki calls on us to do, and maybe that's one of his lessons, is for us not to become desensitized to the horrors.
There is of course a parallel with Jan Karski, another Polish volunteer, amazing guy, who ended up as a teacher of political science in Georgetown University. He went into Auschwitz, I think, twice, but the parallel comes here. He even had an audience with Roosevelt. In London, he met Anthony Eden. Eden didn't trust him. It was simply so far-flung that you couldn't envisage, you couldn't neither morally nor intellectually envisage what was going on. So that is also a parallel between Karski and Pilecki.
Yes, and there's that famous quote when Karski went to the US in 1943 to tell the Americans what was happening, and he met the US Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, who was himself Jewish, and told him what he had witnessed of the Holocaust in Poland, and Frankfurter said to him, "I don't believe you." And Karski, who had personally witnessed trains on their way to death camps, took umbrage and said, "Are you calling me a liar?" to paraphrase. And Frankfurter said, "No, it's not that I'm calling you a liar, I just cannot believe that this is happening." And I think it's
beyond imagination.
It's the moral step that we have to make in order to turn stories of atrocity and horror into action, which is of course Pilecki's great cry to arms, is what can we do to help.
Did you ever try to locate some of the SS men serving in Auschwitz?
We found the family of one very amazing German functionary, a capo, so not an SS man, called Otto Kuzel, who actually saved Pilecki's life in the camp, which I won't go into that story now, but it's in the book. It's an amazing moment in his story. And Otto Kuzel, German, could have lived a fairly comfortable life in the camp, but repeatedly took risks to save Polish and Jewish prisoners in the camp. We tracked down his family. He, after the war, had an incredibly tough time. He lived outside Munich and was seen as a bit of a traitor, seen as, many people said to him, "Oh, well, if you were in a concentration camp, you must have been a criminal. You were on their side, not on ours." And he died neglected and forgotten, except by those prisoners who knew his value. We've spoken to some of the families of SS guards, and I think it's actually incredible to say, to this day, there are still families in denial of what their forebears did. And we're talking about third, in some cases fourth generation, and for my next book project that I'm working on, we're interviewing them and asking them stories, and they have all of the same excuses and
in the famous movie by Claude Lanzmann, Shoah, he tries to film secretly SS guard in Treblinka, Kurt Schuchomel, and Kurt Schuchomel starts singing the Treblinka song. And that was the one time when Lanzmann was about to throw up, and he has been heavily criticized for filming that episode. Nevertheless, that's historical, very important, that you could see Kurt Schuchomel he had moral choice. He could leave. He never left. And if you're really interested in Nazi self-justification, go and read the transcript from the Nazi trial in Munich in 1965, instigated by the Social Democratic Hessen Fritz Bauer, and they take Robert Moltke, to Auschwitz, and he denies the existence of Auschwitz. They show him the Galge, in a special gallows he constructed. He denies it. And of course, at that time in 1965, they received very light sentences. Germany, yes, they have had some sort of retribution, but it was forced through them after the Eichmann trial.
Yeah, well, actually, we were trying to get in touch with the Molke family, but they didn't want to be interviewed or speak about it, which I think says something.
Yeah, exactly. Now, if you compare Karski with Pilecki, what would you say the main similarities and the main differences are?
You know, I think, you know, both men actually came from similar sort of social classes, Catholics,
yes.
military backgrounds,
Yes.
from sort of upper middle class backgrounds.
Polish patriots. Same age.
Same age.
Yeah.
And, you know, of course, there are so many parallels because they were called to do heroic things through the invasion of their country.
Yes.
They saw the horrors of what the Nazis were doing to Polish Jews.
Yeah.
Probably pre-war, both men had some sort of anti-Semitic views towards them, very common in pre-war Poland.
Yeah.
Not the anti-Semitism of the Nazis. It has
The biological one, not the biological, the social and Catholic
right.
Polish anti-Semitism.
Intercommunal
different kinds of anti-Semitism.
tensions that meant that, in fact, Pilecki could live much of his life as a farmer without many interactions with his with his Jewish neighbors, and yet, in that fulcrum of Auschwitz, he was able to look beyond helping his immediate circle of fellow Polish officers interned in the camp to reach out to and risk his life for
It's
the
so
Jews
interesting,
who were
Jack, because you could say those two men had more or less the same social cultural background. I mean, from a sociological point of view, they were very similar, but structural determinants simply do not explain the moral courage. There still is a sense, an area of freedom, of explicit choice, which these two men exemplify. And that's very, very important to note. Hannah Arendt talked about the banality of evil. That's the most misunderstood phrase in the history of the Holocaust. But you could talk about everyday goodness. These are people who simply say, either what would Jesus have done, or isn't it the Swiss way, or these Jews are innocent, as the Bulgarians did. The Jews were saved in Bulgaria. The Bulgarian peasants say, these people are Bulgarians, they haven't done anything wrong. And at that time, the Bulgarian Orthodox Church supported the Jews and the Bulgarian Prime Minister. But then we can have all these sociological studies and try to find out why certain segments of the population would be anti-Semitic or not anti-Semitic. Nevertheless, it remains a rest factor, the moral choice of each individual.
There is a crucial difference, of course, in that whilst I think many of us have heard of Karski, those who followed World War II, Pilecki's story, to take up your opening point, Øivind, was deleted from history, and his had that double injustice that I think really inspired me to be both unheard during World War II, but then for his story, his example, to be hidden from all of us, including his own family, including Poland, until the 90s. I'm pleased to say now that Pilecki in Poland is viewed as a great national hero, as is Jan Karski. It's such a pleasure to sit with Pilecki's children in their 80s and their phones going off the hook all the time because some school is renaming itself the Witold Pilecki School, or there's a new road or square that they're being asked to open up. And I think they are basking in the fact that the memory of their father that they still hold, that they so kindly entrusted to me, is now being recognized both in Poland and I hope slowly, if you all read the book and engage with his story, you'll see what an amazing man he is.
But Jack, would you say, has the present Polish state had a serious moral reckoning with its anti-Semitic past? I mean, the present Polish government has made it unlawful to make references to people who make the mistake of saying Polish concentration camps. That's trivial. Of course, these are not Polish concentration camps. They're Nazi concentration camps on Polish soil. But it also made it very difficult for researchers to ask the awful questions of Polish complicity. During your work, have you encountered this problem?
Well, I think what it's really important to recognize is what the impact of communism was on Poland. To have families like Piotr Wielopolski, like Witold Pilecki, is not able to talk about their incredible heroes for decades. And sometimes when I'm asked, when I answer this question in the US, I say, just imagine what it would be like if the heroes of D-Day, who we celebrate today as the golden generation, were labeled traitors after the war, and to mention their name would lead to your arrest. It's absolutely unthinkable, and yet that was the experience of Poland. And I think we in the West, myself included before I began this research, know so little about what happened in Central and Eastern Europe. It's, we think May 1945, victory in Europe, job done, and we don't recognize that Poland was never able to come to terms with its past.
That's true.
It's incredible to me now, knowing Pilecki's story, that when we think about the great heroes of World War II, we think of Germans like Oskar Schindler or Klaus von Stauffenberg, and not some of the amazing men and women who risked their lives in Eastern Central Europe.
Everyday heroes. Yeah.
And I think, just to answer your question, we in the West, in Norway, in France and Italy, have had 50 years to come to terms with politics of collaboration. We've also had 50 years to find our heroes and to burnish their stories, because we all need, on some level, in popular society, in popular history, to have those who can inspire us as a society and say, yes, we actually did good things during the war, and then that allows us to look at the bad things. And in Poland today was my experience that this is a process that's finally happening. People like Pilecki are finally being recognized, and to answer your point, Øivind, I had incredible access to all archives, every layer of the government, of society wanted to help me to tell this story, and I actually felt like it was a sort of a case study of how, with transparent access, you can tell these stories.
Poland may have done a better job than Hungary.
Yes.
But the present Hungarian government tries to conceal the complicity of the Pilkos, the Arab movement, and the awful killings on the shores of Danube, and trying to, in the monument in Budapest, portraying the angel of evil descending upon an innocent Hungarian population. I think Hungary under Mr. Orban has a longer way to go than Poland. And perhaps your next book should be about that.
I actually have another question as well. It's more, when I read your book, Jack, I had actually another question, that if you heard about Pilecki, you dug into the archives, but would you say that there are many Pileckis in different archives around that haven't been discovered yet?
Well, I think in the writing of the book, of course, it's a biography of one extraordinary man, but he did not act alone, either in Auschwitz or in getting his message out to the Allies in London. He had this incredible network of men, also some amazing women who so inspired me by their courage, who smuggled messages out of the camp, played extraordinary roles. Honestly, I could have chosen multiple characters to write a book about.
Spielberg should make a movie of this.
Well, I'm very pleased to say the book has been optioned to be made into a movie, not by Spielberg, but by an amazing Oscar-winning British film producer. So hopefully we'll be able to share this story on the big screen.
Yes, it's very nice.
Yeah.
Well, listening to you, Jack, I was reminded by the young Bertrand Russell. He has an essay written when he was 20, in which he says, as human beings, we can encounter all kinds of dire straits, awful fates. We know that we shall be dying. We know that the cosmos will disappear in some millions of years. But the true hallmark of humanity, of a human being, is that we can choose how to relate to this fate. That's the hallmark of human freedom. That's what your book is about. He had the choice. He could have lived peacefully, and he had the choice of reacting with his freedom towards the fate. And that, I think, makes your book such an important book, and I'm so glad that it's out in Norwegian, that you have brought it to life for us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's very easy to be a mediator for this talk. You're very...
I warned you. I warned you, Øivind.
Yeah, I knew what I was getting, and I'm very thankful for that, Bernt. So, but very good. But now we'll open the floor for questions. If you have some questions for Jack and Bernt. If you want to pronounce the question in Norwegian, we can try to translate it as well, so it's up to you. I know it's very difficult to be the first guy, but yeah,
it's really
Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. I won't ask a question. I will say a few words inspired by your talk here and later on the very interesting debate. And I will not speak mainly as the Israeli ambassador, I will speak as Alon Roth, the grandson, for example, of Yitzhak Roth, that died in the age of 98 in Israel, but never wanted to talk to me.
Could you repeat the name, sir?
Sorry?
Could you repeat the name of
my grandfather was Yitzhak Roth.
Yes.
He never wanted to tell the story of the family in Hungary, in Transylvania, around Satmar, the small villages, his family that went to Auschwitz in this horrible summer, beautiful summer, by the way. Yeah. And my other grandfather, who came from a small village near Lvov at the time, without any family anymore. They never wanted to say anything. They never wanted to tell the story. They never wanted to keep this flame we're talking about. And this is why, as a second generation to the Holocaust, myself, born in Israel, lived in Israel, representing Israel for 35 years, I'm very, very proud that there are people like you who take such an issue, who put light on an unknown story of these horrible times. I think it is so important. I was last week in Israel with the Norwegian foreign minister, who went for 2 hours to Yad Vashem, passed all over Yad Vashem. And there were two very interesting remarks made there. One remark, contradicting remarks. One remark was that there is more and more research on the Holocaust. There are more archives that are being opened, mainly in the eastern side. But when you open those archives, you understand more the Western archives, so all the stories we all know. But on the same time, the young generation is not knowledgeable. The young generation is not interested. The young generation is not interested in the photos and in the horrible drawings that you showed here, which are the facts. So what do you do with these contradicting things? A story like the one you are telling is the right story to tell, which is a serious research that again is highlighting something that was unknown. I didn't know the whole story the way you described it, even though I knew the name, but not more than that. And at the same time, it is interesting enough in order to keep this flame going on, and igniting again and again the main questions that were debated here as well. Why didn't they bomb? It's not just the RAF, it's the Americans as well later on. And the stories of you can bomb Ploiești, which is in the same distance, but you don't bomb Auschwitz from Italy, for example. Very serious questions that are highlighted in the, let's call it, in the periphery of the main story you are telling of this unbelievable, courageous officer and human that did whatever he did. I will not speak about million questions. I will not ask million questions that I have concerning the ability of someone to take this decision to go there. What kind of network did he build there? Etc., etc. So many questions that arise from what you have said. I'll just say that the failure to take action is, I think, the main issue you are putting forward. When I think on the fact that you are talking about someone who in 1940 already spread the information, and we reached 1944 with 500,000 and how many millions in between that are perishing there. Of course, I ask the questions personally, but I think that this question is eternal, not just because what we see now, elsewhere as well, why people don't take the action when they see atrocities in such heights, and there were atrocities on the way forward with millions of casualties anywhere in the world. So your story, your book is igniting so many questions that are eternal, and I think are taking the time of diplomats and philosophers and researchers and politicians, and will do it in the future. So it's not just a story on the past, it's a kind of a guiding line to the questions that we have to debate in the present in order maybe to have less troubled future. So thank you very much for this, as I said, as the Israeli ambassador, but as Alon wrote, a Jewish person, I can't say young anymore, but a Jewish person that is very happy that such stories are researched and published later. Thank you.
Sir, may I allow me to ask you a question as a representative of the State of Israel? I was a member of the Norwegian UNESCO Commission years ago, and I made a point, following in the wake of, for example, Landsmann's movie Shoah, to ask the Norwegian UNESCO Commission to approach the Israeli government to take more care of Jewish synagogues being converted into parking lots in Eastern Europe. Why hasn't the Israeli government, in conjunction with the UNESCO Commission, more forcefully tried to preserve Jewish synagogues and lots? They are being ruined in the Eastern Europe, and that must be a terrible paradox.
I will say just one very small thing, and related to my own experience. I think that more and more cooperation, not just between the governments, but between the civil societies, between NGOs, is happening, both in Poland, in Israel, and together, and you hear more and more stories. I read it almost on a monthly basis, on something that was reenacted, that was, that is reborn. Yeah. It can be a cemetery, it can be a synagogue, it can be something else that used to be Jewish or used to be Polish Jewish together. And you read more and more. So I cannot answer your question, precisely on the UNESCO stuff, etc. I can tell you that my feeling is that the trend is that more and more it happens. I visited Krakow few years ago, and just sitting in a restaurant with some other Israeli friends, I was approached by someone who asked me, "Are you Israeli?" I I said, yes, I'm in Israel. He said, can you come with me tomorrow? I want to show you 50 kilometers from here, from Krakow, something that we're doing in a small village in order to restore the old. And they did it with an American philanthropist whose family came from there. So it was all together. I didn't go to see it, but you know, you see it more and more, which gives me an impression that it will happen in the future and the numbers will be
Hungary is the
much
next
bigger.
target. Hungary is much worse than Poland, for the time being.
It's his next book.
That's his next book.
Jack, do you have anything to say to
Well,
the investor? Or?
Lone, thank you so much for sharing that. It's incredibly touching. And, you know, I think when we think about the lack of action that Pilecki encountered, you know, I think we have to also reflect on our own time and, you know, think about what's happening in Ukraine. And I think we can even judge ourselves, you know, are we maintaining our outrage and shock and horror? You know, my big fear is that whilst we have the lessons of World War II, that we end up accepting, coming to terms, ignoring, forgetting what's happening in Ukraine. And so I think I've been reflecting on the last few weeks about how to stay active, whether it's contacting my old editor friends and telling them, you know, this is a great story, he's got to keep this coverage up, or whether it's writing to my local MP saying this is, you know, we have to take action, because I think that's one of our roles today, and as it is to also remember the Holocaust, find new ways to tell that story. You know, so many of the people that I spoke to for the writing of this book are now dead. We have such a huge challenge ahead of us, everyone in this room, to keep alive the memory of the Holocaust, the memory of the horrors of the Nazi occupation of Poland, and find new ways to tell that story. And I, you know, hope Pilecki's story can be one way to do that, but there are others that we have to keep the flame alive, keep people outraged by what happened.
Thank you. Yeah, there are any more questions? Yeah, Guri?
A small question. I mean, it's so moving to listen to you, Jack Fairweather, and your moving introduction. Back to the family. What were not everybody here has read your book, and what were the family told when a husband was killed, a father was killed, and how is the family reaction now to your in-depth story? I mean, this is also a part of European history, but it's also a part of a family history and a part of a nation's history.
So I can remember being very moved when talking to Andrei and Zofia. Their mother tried to protect them from the trial that took place after Pilecki's arrest, but they sat in their school in 1948 and heard on the school tannoy system, Witold Pilecki has been executed today, traitor to the people. Everyone looked at them and they couldn't say anything. They could never say anything in the years that followed.
Have you tried to look up the communists responsible for this?
The communist press covering the trial, yes.
And what do they say? Any shade of shame?
Oh, you mean now?
No. Have you looked at the people who were responsible at that time?
Oh.
They must be alive.
Yes, well, actually, he died not so long ago, but actually the prosecutor who sought Pilecki's death sentence was still alive. I never got to speak to him, but... He was Jewish, wasn't he? He was, yes, he was Jewish.
Jewish, yes.
And he was confronted by one of the resistance cell that Pilecki belonged to in communist Poland, and said, how could you do this? And of course, it's the answer that we know from Nazi Germany post-war,
yes.
Coming to terms, I was just following orders. You know, that's of course why we have Nuremberg, why we have the International Criminal Court in The Hague, is to remind everyone that it's not about following orders. We all have moral agency. We
It's
all
the Nuremberg trial, yes.
right. So anyway, back to your question. You know, I was always very moved by that story, and my book won a major award in the UK, in which I got to get up and tell everyone in the room and the cameras about that story of Andrei and Zofia learning of their father's death, the years of hardship that followed because the family was ostracized. The only job that Maria could get was cleaning toilets in an orphanage. The family lived in dire poverty, and you know, the story of Witold unknown to them. And I said that to the room, and you know, Andrei, because I think one of the secrets of being very happy in your old age is to be super connected. Somehow he'd learned that I'd won the book award, and he called me up shortly thereafter and said, "Jack, you know, thank you for telling, you know, for getting Pilecki's story out there." And honestly, I was in tears at that, you know, having that connection to the family and being able to be someone to help tell this amazing man's story.
It's a very moving story, and I'm so proud that Press, Håkon Harket, and his companions have translated it into Norwegian. We put it to use teaching. I teach a course on genocide, so we put it to use, and I'm very grateful.
Thank you very much. And it's a possibility to buy the book downstairs after we're finished here. This has been a very interesting evening for me. Thank you very much, both Bernt and Jack. And I would leave the floor to to the director of the center, my boss, Guri Hjeltnes.
My boss too.
Yeah, your boss too. I thought I was not going to mention that actually. But
Gentlemen.
Gentlemen.
Thank you.
She calls me gentleman.
Yes, I know.
Thank you, Jack Fairweather, for actually coming here. We have at the Holocaust Center. We expected this to happen last fall because Press, the publisher, approached us last, I think, September or something. But I mean, and we were waiting a little bit, and then your book came out, and then Norway closed again. So now we're here, and we're so grateful that you could come. And so thank you so much. And I'd like to invite everybody now for coffee and twisted bun. If you don't know what that is, at kaffe og kringle.
Danish pastry.
That is what we really do here at the Venneforeningen, at the behest of the Venneforening, the Friends Society. And thank you so much, Jack Fairweather. Thank you so much, Bernt, and thank you so much, Øivind. And now we continue in the cafe. And thank you so much, and a big hand for the gentleman, okay?